Greetings, tape shaggers, tapeworms, tape aficionados. In this video, I will be producing a review, summary of features, tutorial and demo of this unit, the Yamaha MT2X. If you've visited this channel before, then you know that I, Tetrakan, not really my name, do reviews, teardowns, repair tips of Porter Studios and other multi-track cassette recorders. After the intro, we're going to summarise when this came out, what was on the market at the same time, how it fits into the oeuvre of the multi-track cassette recorder and what I think of it, before going through each of the features one by one and giving you sort of background knowledge that you might need to understand this technology, and then going on to demonstrate all the features in action in the creation of a recording. If you want to jump to a particular section, then there will be chapters in the little bar at the bottom of YouTube. They'll probably be in a pinned comment, or otherwise you can find them in the video description down at the bottom of the screen. But after we come back from the introduction, I'll start off with the review part of the video. Contrary to what I said in the introduction, before we go into the review, I'm going to show you a sound demonstration. Later in the video, I'll be recording a cover of Blood of My Enemies by Manowar. You're hearing a digital capture. I haven't done any mastering, it's just the sound of the machine that you're hearing. Of light, mighty messengers, heal and rage, coming, gods of the dead. I ride through the air and laugh as I die. Hours of evil, dark knowledge is mine. The ride of the wicked, the function was just killed with a warning for blood now at last. Strong winds, magic mist, to Asgard the boundaries cry. Amen, they carry the dead with the blood of my enemies lie. My less than infallible method for dating these machines is to look at an archive called Musings, which archives press articles from the British music press, and the earliest mention I can see of this unit is from 1988, though there's anecdotal evidence to say that it actually came out in 1987. But this article from 1988 prices the unit at £599, which in today's money, that is 2023 money, would be over £1,580, which is a little over 1,977 US dollars. I'm using the Bank of England's inflation calculator and xe.com to come by those figures. So in that market, what's it competing against? Well, things like the Porta 03 and Porta 05 have just come out from Tascam. The Tascam Porta 2 was still in production. The Tascam 246 was still in production. Where were Fosdix at this time? I know that the X30 was still in production. The 280 was maybe out at this time. So where does this unit sit in terms of the complexity of its features when compared to these competitors? I made a video a while ago listing 5 key factors when assessing a multitrack cassette recorder. So the first of those is size and weight, and this is not a large unit at all. This is about 41 by 26 centimetres, the surface area of it, and it weighs about 3.5 kilograms, which when you consider that this has an internal transformer rather than using an external AC to DC adapter, isn't a lot of weight. Let me make this size comparison. Here's a Tascam 414, now there may be a bit of lens distortion here, but it's pretty much the same size, and this is a unit that's popular because it seemed to be one of the smallest units that has a good feature set. Well, this is a lot less of a legible of a design in a way. I've joked before that this is like Sauron's 4-track because of this kind of black design, but it's got a lot more stuff packed into it actually. It's got 6 channels rather than 4 like the 414. It's dual speed, which the 414 is not, and it has dedicated controls for the tape cue monitor. You can see the tape speed here is available either at 4.8 or 9.5 centimetres per second, which is directly equivalent to 1 7/8 inches per second and 3 3/4 inches per second, respectively, if you're working with imperial rather than metric. And as per this switch here, we can turn DBX noise reduction on and off. It is possible to record all 4 tape tracks simultaneously, and with mixer channels 1 through 4, we can either do that in a direct mode where the input socket is sent directly to the tape recorder, or we can bus it, so we can do things like some multiple mic inputs to create a mono blend or a stereo blend on 2 tracks. It doesn't have a mid-range EQ, but we do have a per channel as opposed to per mixer bus high and low shelf EQ. There's a single auxiliary send and stereo auxiliary returns. We could also return the auxiliary signal back through the channels 5 and 6, so we've got the option of EQing and panning our effects returns. And the unit does include direct tape outs, so in the modern day, if we want to capture the 4 tracks of tape as individual WAV files and do our mixing or any mastering or other post-production in the digital domain, then that is easy to do. The other thing that's interesting about this is there's an expansion port here in a couple of places for screws, and this is where you can add a YMC2, which is an FSK to MIDI converter. So I do tend to debate myself whether MIDI synchronization is a useful feature to have in the present day, but obviously this was very important in the late 80s before the advent of digital audio workstations and so on. And so there is a kind of box that's like, you know, maybe yay big again that will screw on here and it will turn like a pulse signal that's recorded to your sacrificial track number 4 into MIDI information, meaning that your MIDI computer would slow down and speed up to match the inconsistencies of the tape speed. So that combination of features puts this in a bit of an elite class in a way, although this has got mechanical cassette transport buttons as opposed to tactile switches or any of the digital hoo-ha that goes with that. This is much more like a 246 than it is like a Tascam 414. I would place this really as being like a dual speed Tascam Porta 2. That's what it's closest to in its features and its size. It's very slightly smaller than the Porta 2, although it feels more compact. And it is more compact really because you don't have to carry around a wall wart. transformers inside it. The mechanical cassette player that's in there is this GEC branded cassette player that I've made a whole series of videos about refurbishing. It's a bit of a finicky one to get right, but everything else in here is very nicely accessible. There's not a lot of disassembly, there's not millions of different kinds of screws and fasteners to take this apart. And the really good news in terms of price is I went on to UK eBay to see how much these are selling for, and these tend to fetch less money than much less richly featured and frankly poorer quality units from Tascam. So at the moment, if you want to buy a faulty Porta 02, you're going to pay about 100 quid on eBay, but for less than that you could get a faulty one of these. And this has just got a lot more features. The extra mixer channels, the effects returns, dual speed, the noise reduction, dedicated monitor controls to keep what you're hearing as you perform separate from what the tape player hears, and all in a format that you can easily put into a backpack or into, like, a pannier bag on a bike. So making this video may spoil that obviously, but at the moment this is a bit of a sleeper. It seems to be very good value for money. Moving on to the features overview section of the video, we can turn this unit on using the switch up here at the back. Power light comes on here, and we don't need a tape in the cassette player in order for it to work. Maybe you can hear that. It's not completely silent. Better with the door closed. This is a tape player with mechanical buttons. Record, play, rewind, fast forward, stop and pause. If you're already familiar with the technology, you know that there's no erase button. We erase by recording silence over the existing recordings. Those mechanical controls contrast with the tactile switches that you might find on later units like the MT2X, MT2X. There you press a little button and then solenoids move all the mechanical parts, but here levers are actually being pressed by the force of your fingers. You also see that we have a mechanical counter. There's a resetting button here. When that zero stop is on, when I rewind to zero, it will actually stop. There's a solenoid in there that will cause the mechanism to stop. And the fact that we have mechanical buttons means that we don't have access to some of the digitally assisted punch in and punch out that you would get on the other models that I mentioned there. We do have a punch in out socket at the front here, and no doubt Yamaha had their own foot pedal and they recommended that you only use their foot pedal, but I can assure you that if you use a dual polarity piano sustain pedal, then that works perfectly well. The tape speeds 4.8 and 9.5 centimeters are selected here. So the lower of those is like the commercial tape speed that you would use in like a Walkman, an old-fashioned car, cassette player. At this higher speed, more magnetic domains, which we can think of almost like pixels for the sound, are passing by the head every second, so the tape is better able to represent this particularly high frequency information, and we get slightly less hiss. At that higher speed, obviously go through your tapes twice as fast, so you're only recording on one side of a C60, that's 30 minutes to begin with. At high speed, you've only got 15 minutes to record your songs on. I just press play so we can just about see the heads here, with only a couple of exceptions that I've only heard of and never seen. Every multitrack cassette player has this two head design where the erase head, ferrite in this case, is on the left, and the play record head, which is made of permalloy. It's a very durable metal anyway, you don't tend to see them getting worn down like you would do on a reel-to-reel player or a consumer cassette deck. Anyway, that's on the right, and internally that's switching between the record and playback amplifiers. You can't record and play as you could do in a reel-to-reel player, so this isn't a kind of unit that you can use as a delay machine, but then neither is any of its competitors. I'll do a bit more of an explanation about AC bias later in the video as we move on to the tutorial section, but I'll just note at this point that this will be biased out of the factory for use with Chrome Type 2 tape. I would have thought you're going to get very weak sounding recordings and possibly improper arrays if you try and use Type 4 tape in here. Type 1 tape will work and it won't do any harm. The ferrous particles on Type 1 tape tend to shed a bit more, so you'll want to get in and clean those heads more often. Type 1 tape to begin with isn't going to represent the highs as well. In addition to that, it's going to be receiving a bit more bias mixed in with the audio signal coming out of the record play head and record mode than it really wants, and that means there's going to be a bit of an emphasis on the mids and low mids, which strictly speaking isn't high fidelity, so experiment, you may subjectively like it even though it's, from an audiophile's point of view, not a step in the right direction. We have 6 1/4-inch jack input sockets at the front. They're unbalanced, but in my experience, unless you've got like really bad radio interference or electromagnetic interference near where you live, or you're running very long cable lengths, balanced cables aren't going to do that much for you in a home studio situation. There is no phantom power, there are no XLR sockets. So if you need to power a microphone that uses phantom power, then you're going to need some sort of adapter plug or external preamp that supplies phantom power, and then run the output of that via unbalanced cables into here. And if you're not familiar with this stuff, it's actually pretty rare to get either XLR input sockets, and especially phantom power on these units. We have a single headphone socket that is placed here, as is usually the case with these sorts of things, because the impedance relationship is different and they're trying to output more current out of a headphone socket, then it tends to be a bit hissier than what you'll hear out of the line out. Monitor controls here give us an independent mix of what's coming back from the tape player, which we can listen to during tracking, which is different from how we set the mixer, because it's always very important to keep what we hear while performing separate from what is received by the cassette player. Sometimes in these units you'll find that there's a separate output for the monitor bus. Not so with this. The output of these only comes out through the headphone socket. On the back here, we've got a stereo out, we've got individual tape outs, we've got a synchronisation input and output. Our expansion socket here to add the YMC2 MIDI adapter. Then over at the left here we've got 3 1/4-inch jack sockets. That's a mono auxiliary send and stereo auxiliary returns. So I suppose you could use them as a submix for the talent during tracking, but the main intention, so far as I can see, is to use that as an effect send and return. Preamps wise, we've only got amplifiers that will lift a signal from line level up to mic level on inputs 1 and 2. Inputs 3, 4, 5 and 6 are expecting a line level signal. So if you want to input microphone signals, then you'll need an external preamplifier ahead of those 4 sockets. As with the majority of multitrack cassette recorder designs, the mixer is dual function, and there's a switch that decides whether this is an input mixer that is taking signals to the tape player, or whether it's a mixing and monitoring mixer where the signal's coming from the tape player. So these switches here beside the first 4 tracks dictate which of those modes the channel is in. So up here it says tape, so that signal coming from the tape and through the mixer. We can turn it off, or we can say mic line, in which case it's expecting a signal to come in from this socket, and then that signal is being sent to the tape player. Channels 5 and 6 are a slight exception, where they're always routed to the master fader. The master fader is always connected to the stereo out, but depending on how we set these record select switches, inputs signals from channels 1, 2, 3 and 4 during the tracking stage of recording may or may not be passing through there when we're using the unit to record a signal to tape as opposed to play a signal back from tape. Where that signal is taken from the mixer architecture is selected using these 4 record select switches here. If we put these in the up position, then the input of this mixer channel is taken before the fader but after the EQ and sent to track 1 of the tape. Likewise, input from number 2 is taken post EQ but pre-pan and going to track 2, and input 3, channel 3 goes to track 3 and so on. The other option is, and if I just turn all of these off except this track 1 record select and put that in left mode, you can see that there's a right mode for tracks 2 and 4 and a left mode for tracks 1 and 3. What these switches are saying in this position is I am going to record anything that is coming in from the left hand side of the master fader, and I'm going to take that signal and I'm going to put it in track 1 of the tape. The point of this mode is to be able to sum multiple mixer channels to a single track, or to make a stereo image from a blend of different signals. This mode is also important for bouncing. So say I recorded 3 tracks and I wanted to make a mono blend. So track 4 of the tape is receiving its input from whatever's coming on the right hand side of this fader. So I would then pan tracks 1, 2 and 3, put them in tape mode, so basically they're playing back, and then set a blend, set my EQ, and then those 3 signals would be baked onto track 4 of the tape, and then I could reuse tracks 1, 2, 3, and that way I would actually have 6 layers of recording at that point. The EQ is shelving type. The high EQ is centered around 10 kHz and the low EQ is centered around 100 Hz. We have an auxiliary send for all 6 of the channels. We would send a mono signal to an effects pedal. If it had a mono in and a stereo out, then we can return it in stereo, or we could take those outputs of the stereo effects unit and put them in through channels 5 and 6, and that way we could EQ or reverb. You know, we could add low end, subtract some highs, or vice versa from an echo or whatever. While we're tracking, these faders act as a fine-tune control. You get a slightly narrower gradation of how loud and quiet the signal is compared to the mic line trimmers here, which are a bit more extreme. Set at around 7, it's unity gain. We get a bit of a boost above there, and then we can cut our signal all the way down to silence here. We have LED based meters, 4 of them. Mode selection here decides whether this is the stereo with left here and right here, or in 4-track mode, then it's going to show what's already playing back from the tape, or if you're in a recording mode, then it's the level of the inputs being received at the corresponding sockets. So we can't really directly monitor what's coming on it on 5 and 6, only playing in the signal that's going into there and then putting this meter select into stereo mode. One thing that's slightly irritating about this is that we do need to be in record mode in order to see the inputs from the socket. So normally what we'd have to do is find a bit of tape where we're not worried about the pop in pop out glitches that we get when we initiate recording, and we would pause and then hit record and play, and then any input signal in here would appear in the meters. But as soon as I stop it, it would be showing any recording that's already on the tape. This sync switch here has 2 modes, record, playback, and the central one off. This relates to using FSK and MIDI, and because I don't have much experience using that stuff, and I certainly don't have the YMC2 accessory that allows you to convert MIDI data to FSK and back and forth, I'm not going to be discussing that, or certainly not demonstrating it. Roughly speaking, if you want to record MIDI data and convert it into FSK, which is on track 4 via the sync input here, then you would put that in record mode, and then once you're sending that FSK signal back out through the MIDI conversion gadgetry to an external MIDI device, then you would put that in playback mode. But yeah, you won't see me doing that in this tutorial later. We have the facility to turn DBX on and off here. DBX is an encode and decode process, so we really want to either record hot and have it off both for recording and playback, or record at more moderate levels with DBX on and then just stick to that. So I think that's me covered all the features here, and can move on to doing a bit of a tutorial. Okay, let's begin the tutorial section of the video by ensuring that you can play back tapes okay. So you'll see up here I've got some RCA cables plugged into the stereo output sockets. If you don't know what an RCA socket looks like, I'm going to put some pictures up on the screen now. You'll recognise those as being the sort of typical wires that you use to connect like separates in a home stereo system. You can get them anywhere. Amazon, eBay, local hardware shop, probably supermarkets, all sorts of places will carry them. Anyway, I've got those plugged into a pair of powered speakers here. You could use input on your home stereo. If you don't have speakers, then you're going to use your headphone socket. What you don't want to do is plug your headphone socket into your speakers, because the headphone socket is intended to drive little speakers of their own, so the current's higher, the impedance relationship is a little bit different. Don't worry about that if that word scares you, it's not super important. Before I even put a cassette in here, let's have a bit of a primer about tape technology. A cassette such as this one consists of a roll of plastic tape that's got little specks of metal glued to one side. You heard me, one side. There's a misconception that there is sound on both sides of the tape. There is not. The way that a standard cassette player, like, you know, a stereo cassette player that you maybe had in your home stereo in the 80s if you were alive then, it's got a head that only reads the top half of the tape, and that has 2 tracks on it, a left one and a right one. One goes to the left speaker, one goes to the right speaker. And when you turn the tape over, the head is reading information that's printed on the other half of the tape, which is recorded in the opposite direction. The way that a 4-track works, all 4 of those tracks are mono, and we can control the level of them separately. So this means that if I put in a 4-track recording, I'll show you what it sounds like going forward the way a little bit. This is a recording I've made, it's just demoing an idea. If I put that tape in backwards, all 4 of those tracks are going to play backwards. actually sounds better than Ford's. But if you've got a standard tape, and I'm going to use Cold Cuts by the Brothers Nylon with Drome, because they're probably not going to put a copyright strike on me. I'm going to change the tape speed, and I'll explain that in a minute, but tracks 1 and 2 have got the left and right information on them for one side, but tracks in 3 and 4, you've got side B. Here it's going backwards. If we want to hear that track go in the right direction, I need to turn the tape over and turn up tracks 1 and 2. Okay, so if you get like an old tape and stuff when it's playing backwards, don't think there's something wrong with your cassette player. That might sound dumb to some of you watching this, but you've got to remember there are some folk literally half my age and just didn't grow up with this technology. So for their benefit, I'm just pointing out that it is normal to have forward tracks and tracks 1 and 2 and backward tracks in 3 and 4. If you combine those, you're going to get some pretty weird results here. Like, I've been contacted by people who are hearing the forwards track, but they're hearing the backwards stuff, and they think the backwards stuff is caused by an electronic problem. It's not. Your multi-track cassette recorder is operating normally. The other thing to address here is your speed setting. So if we just go back to only playing one side of this Brothers Nylon and Drome tape, that sounds quite normal at the moment because I've got it at 4.8 centimeters per second, which is the standard speed for like a Walkman, car stereo or something. But if I put this in the high speed, it sounds like Chipmunks or GABA or something. We have this setting to make the tape go past twice as fast. Remember I was saying there were specks of metal on here? Those specks of metal are called domains, and you can think of them as being a little bit like the pixels in the digital image. If you try and represent something simple, like a smiley face, you can do that with hardly any pixels. But if you want to make a detailed portrait, a 16 by 16 pixel display is not going to give you a detailed portrait of somebody famous. I'm going to pick a famous person at random. Oh god, everyone I'm thinking of is awful. Right, Nicolas Cage. I can handle Nicolas Cage. I can't represent Nicolas Cage in 16 by 16 pixels. I need more pixels to make it look like him rather than just some random squidgy guy. And sort of this is maybe a terrible analogy. The more domains you have passing over the head every second, then the easier it is for the tape to represent high frequency information. So you get crisper high end. If you don't know what high end or high frequency means, like, this is a low frequency sound. Whereas this sound is higher frequency. So stuff like the sizzly bits of drum kit or piano are going to sound clearer at this higher tape speed. You also get a bit less hiss at the higher tape speed. So you get better quality, but it means that you run through the tape faster. So this is a 60-minute tape. We're only recording on one side of it, remember? So already we're down to 30 minutes. And then if we put that in the higher speed, then actually we've only got 15 minutes. So, you know, 3 typical songs maybe per tape. But it does mean if you've got recordings that were recorded at a low speed and you play them at high speed, it sounds really chipmunky. Like that. It also means if we take this high speed recording again, I quickly remind you what that sounded like. If I play that at the lower speed, oh god, it sounds like I'm dying of a ketamine overdose. Yeah, unless you're going for some sort of special effect, you want to play back your tapes at the same speed that they were recorded at, right? Make a decision when you start a song whether you're going to have noise reduction on or off. DBX noise reduction, it reduces the sound of the noise quite a bit more than Dolby noise reduction does, but it has more artifacts and it affects EQ more. You can think of it reducing highs or emphasizing lows. I mean, I don't mind the sound of it. You need to be a little bit careful, especially with things like uncompressed bass guitar that can kind of screw with it. I've heard people say that the echoes from like high-end echo machines, DBX screws with that a little bit. You can get around that by turning off and just recording things hot, and then your signal is going to be quite high compared to the noise of the tape. But if you start to mix it, you get some funny effects. I'll try and show this by going back to the Brothers Nylon and Drome. So that sounds kind of clear, right? But if I put on the DBX, there's a sort of muffled pumping thing that it'll do to recordings that weren't recorded with DBX, because effectively it's trying to decode a recording that hasn't been treated with this mixture of compression and expansion, which I won't attempt to explain. It's outside the scope of this video. And before we do any recording, I also want to talk a little bit about the tape type. Here you can see that I'm using a TDK Type 2 position chrome tape, and this is the tape that the unit is biased for. What does bias mean? Well, let's quickly talk about how recording works. Remember I said there's lots of little specks of metal on there? There is a relationship between electricity and magnetism, where an electrical current creates a magnetic field and vice versa. And so when we take the electrical signals that represent our music and we put them into the little electromagnet, which is contained inside this head, that shoots that onto the little specks of metal on here. And because the mechanical part of the cassette player is drawing the tape across that head, then the patterns of magnetism correspond to the electrical patterns. When we play the recording back, then the magnetism gets turned back into an electrical signal again, okay? That's the basics of it, but what people discovered is if you just stick the electrical AC signal that represents the music straight onto the tape, you get distortion and a weak signal. And what was eventually discovered was that one way to improve the recording is to mix that signal with a very high frequency sine wave. Effectively, this kind of like excites the magnetic particles so that they respond in a more one-to-one way with the musical signal. But because the frequency of this sine wave is higher than the highest sound that a human being can hear, we don't hear it. It just has this effect of like warming up the tape. I've described it before as like warming wax enough so that you can make a good handprint in it. So depending on which metal specs are on the tape, the amount of this sine wave that we call AC bias is different. Generally speaking, Type 1 tapes need less of it, Type 2 tapes need more of it, Type 3's not really a thing for historical reasons, but Type 4 tapes need the most of it. So the amount of this wiggly AC that's getting mixed in with your audio signal at that play record head is designed for this kind of tape. So if you're looking for like as clear a representation on tape as possible, then this is the type of tape to get. If you put Type 1 tapes in there, it will still record. In fact, it'll record a bit louder, and it won't do any harm to your machine. The ferric particles that are on Type 1 tapes tend to shed a bit more, so you'll want to kind of clean the heads a bit more often, but it's not a problem. The only thing is that, for one thing, because there's larger and therefore fewer of these metal specks on the Type 1 tape, it's not as capable of representing high frequency information as a Type 2 tape to begin with. And in addition to that, because the amount of this AC sine wave, this bias that's being sent to the tape is more than it needs, that changes the EQ as well in a way that you might find you like, but it's not audiophile, right? You're going to end up with a much more kind of bassy and sort of saturated recording if you use Type 1 tape. Experiment with it. You might like it. It won't do any harm, but I personally use Type 2 tapes. Another thing that seems to confuse some people to begin with is, how do you erase music? And you do that by just recording silence. So I've taken the liberty of recording some garbage on this tape. Let's have a listen to that. So we've got blah 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 on track 1. Rhubarb on track 2. A tissue in track 3, and
oh my god, oh my god, oh my god,
and a whole bunch of oh my gods in track number 4. So if I go back to 0 on the tape, I can just turn these off for safety's sake. Just pull the 4 faders down, but then arm tracks 1, 2, 3, 4. I'll go to 4 and start recording there. So we'll hear all this nonsense talk on the 4 tracks, and it'll cut out at 4, right? So I am now recording silence onto the tape. Put all of those into safe mode again. If I turn up these tracks, create a bit of a stereo blend here. Tape mode. For the first 4 increments on this, you're going to hear me talking a lot of rubbish, and then it's going to cut out at 4. And then it cuts out. Okay. So all you can hear is the tape hiss at this point because the DBX is off. Let's think about why that works. I'll put this in play mode so we can see the heads again. The erase head is on the left and the tape is coming from this supply reel to this take-up reel here, and it's passing over the erase head first. So when it records, that AC bias that I was talking about, that's coming out of the erase head, and what that does is it just kind of resets all the domains on the tape back to random states of magnetism, which we hear as a low-level tape hiss. And the erase is always working before the record head. So if the information on the tape isn't being replaced by the record head after the erase head has done its thing, then silence will occur. The other thing to be aware of is that we do need to have this tab present in the top left corner. So if you're reusing pre-recorded tapes, like look at this Brothers Nylon and Drone one, there's a space there that will prevent a lever that's in the top left corner of this mechanism from closing, which will mean you won't be able to press the record button down, so you'd have to cover that up with tape. Bear in mind, if you've got a tape like that, it's probably ferric type 1, so it's going to be subject to those EQ issues that you might subjectively like, but which are technically bad fidelity. Next thing we'll look at here is how EQ and sound effects work on this unit. We want to do this before we do any recording, because actually we can apply effects and EQ at any stage of the recording process. We can apply it during tracking, we can apply it during overdubbing, during bouncing, during mixdown. So I've got the same demo tape in here that I recorded with a Fostix 260 a while ago. Fostix uses Dolby, so I've got DBX turned off. At the moment, just the drum channel is up. You can see that the auxiliary master controls, the return and send are both up around 7. Again, this is like unity gain really. And so if I use the auxiliary send on this drum track, then I'm going to send a dry copy of it to this pedal. It's coming out of the auxiliary send jack socket through this black cable to the mono input of this Zoom multi-stop. I've got a Hall effect with the decay up high, the mix at 100%. So what's coming out of both the left and right output of this into the left and right auxiliary returns is 100% wet. So let's play that and hear how it sounds. Just a dry sound. I'm not suggesting that that sounds good. I've just made it a very obvious effect to demonstrate it. Now you'll notice that it is post-fader. I could do that with other instruments as well. Let's demonstrate that with a keyboard. Because we have independent auxiliary sends per channel, then we could have a wet keyboard with a dry drum, or vice versa, have dry keyboard, wet drums. The thing to note here is that if we set up the record select switches to record from the left or right bus, because the effect is being reintroduced at the master bus, it will record the sound of the reverb. So that means that we can actually bake the output of our effects device to tape during bouncing or tracking. Now I'm going to turn the effects down there and just show you how the EQ is sounding on some of these instruments. Let's start with the bass. If we pull out that 100 Hz signal, stuff like that, really emphasize the low end by boosting the low and cutting the high. We can get more of that angry fizz by turning up the high end. Here on the guitar, if I pull down the high end, it becomes more mid-focused. So you can almost get like a mid-boost by pulling down the high end, or I can get more presence by boosting it. Because it's quite a high guitar part, the 100 Hz isn't going to do all that much to it. On the drums, you're going to be able to hear both forms of EQ quite well. Hear the lot more thump from the toms. Kick drum when I turn up the low end. I can hear a lot more of the cymbals by turning up the high. That drum signal has already been bounced down from 3 individual mic signals. I hope you can see that if we were to use all 6 channels of the mixer, as we will do later, then we can set the EQ on a mic by mic basis. So I might want to turn down the high end and boost the lows a little bit on a microphone that was pointing at a floor tom, but I might want to emphasize the high end a bit for overheads. Those are decisions that I can bake into a tape, meaning it's destructive. I can't redo the EQ without redoing the recording as I'm tracking or bouncing, or I can do it in a non-destructive way when I'm playing things back at mixdown. Though depending on how you've combined signals using the mixer during tracking or bouncing, you do have less control during playback, because as I've just shown there, I can only apply high and low EQ to the entire drum kit at this point, but during tracking I would have control over the individual microphones. When we begin a new project, it's usually useful to do what's called zeroing the mixer. That is taking every setting that's on the machine and putting it back to a default value. Doing this avoids making a recording then realising that you're adding loads of EQ to it, or you're bouncing 2 recordings together, that kind of thing. So I've intentionally got all these controls at random settings, and I'm going to zero all of them now. So I'm going to make sure that all the record selects are in the off position. All my EQs in a neutral position where they're neither boosting nor cutting any of the frequencies. I'm going to turn down all of the auxiliary sounds. Make sure that sync is turned off. For tracking, I probably want to have the meter select in 4-track mode. I'm going to turn down the monitor controls here. I've just reset the mechanical counter because I know the tape's where I want it to be. Make sure that the pitch control is in the centre and I'm at the correct tape speed. I'm going to be recording at the higher tape speed of 9.5 centimetres per second. I do want auto stop on. I'm going to put all my pan controls in the centre here. Turn up the headphone to about 1/3 of the way. Pull down the master fader. The headphone selection mode won't matter too much at the moment because I'm going to be monitoring through the speakers. I've decided I'm going to have DBX on for this recording, so I'll make sure that it's on both during recording and playback. I'm going to pull down all of my faders, pull down the gain that's available on inputs number 1 and 2, and set the selection switches to off for the first 4 mixer channels. The next thing that I would usually do is give a little bit of forethought and planning to which pieces of music I'm going to record onto which tracks. You can do that on a piece of paper, on your phone. I'm going to do it on a bit of masking tape, which I'm going to stick here because there isn't really space on this model below the faders themselves. I've decided that track 1 is going to contain the drum machine, track 2 is going to contain the vocals, 3 will contain the bass, and 4 will contain a guitar. These decisions partly reflect which order I'm going to record these signals in, but they also reflect the fact that input channels 1 and 2 allow me to add more gain to the signal, whereas inputs 3 through 6 are expecting a line level signal. We will talk a little bit more about signal levels in due course. Probably the simplest way to make a recording on a machine like this is to build up one mono track at a time using the direct record mode. I'm going to do this fairly quickly and with a minimum of explanation, and then I'll come back afterwards and point out some pitfalls and details and nuances. I've got the unit turned on now. Also, this is a multi-stub. It's got the same Hall reverb setting on it. I'll be using it later on. And here I've got this little pocket operator drum machine. It's plugged into input 1. We will discuss the connecting wires for that in more detail shortly. So I'm going to set the record select switch track 1 into the up position, which is the direct mode, meaning anything that comes in on input 1 is going to go to tape track 1. If I were to send that signal to the reverb, it wouldn't be included because the signal is going from this input channel to the tape after this fader, but before it hits this pan control or this master control. This switch here is in the lowest position, mic line, meaning that this channel of the mixer is accepting an external signal rather than monitoring the signal that's coming from the tape. We could hear the drum machine coming through the speakers there, but we didn't see it appear on the meters. One of the quirks of this machine is this needs to be in recording mode before the signal will appear on the meters. So I'm going to hit pause first and then record and play together. Now when I press the drum machine, we could see that signal appearing here. It was getting up to 0 decibels there, but not much above, so I shouldn't get too much tape saturation, providing that the machine is well calibrated. Notice that the fader's at about 7 for unity gain, but this gain trim is about maybe a third of the way up from line level up to mic level. We'll talk about that later. But if I unpause this, it's going to be recording. Here we go. Stop. Rewind. It's going to stop automatically at 0 because I've got the 0 stop setting turned on. If I move this to tape, we can monitor what we just recorded. And I'm satisfied that that isn't either too quiet, so it's close to the noise floor, or too loud, so it's going to clip or distort or saturate too much. We can move on to the next track. I've unplugged the drum machine. I've plugged in the bass instead to input number 3. That allows me to record to tape track number 3 using direct mode. So I'll turn the record arm for track 1 off and set the record arm for track 3 to direct mode. I'll explain this distinction more later, but because I'm going to record all these tracks in direct mode, I can monitor things through the speakers without any risk of bouncing. So I can leave the input select for mixer channel 1 in tape mode with the fader up so I can hear the drum machine. I've turned up the fader for track 3. I need to turn that to line input though. Now the bass should be audible, but it's not appearing on the meter yet. For that, I need to pause it and put it in record. Very slightly, so it's only just peaking at 0. With DBAX on, I don't usually want to go over 0. If I'm going to saturate the tape, go up into the red, that's usually more effective with DBAX turned off in my experience, although your mileage may vary. I'm just going to check what the levels are, so I'm not going to record just now. I'll just put that back. I'm happy with those relative levels. I could of course make track 1 a little bit louder or a little bit quieter using this fader if I hadn't been happy with that. So I'll rewind back to 0, record. Good enough. Rewind that back. Turn the record mode off. Put track 3 into tape mode. And let's hear back what we just recorded. So we can control the level here. It's worked. So we can go on and overdub guitar over there. I now have my effects pedals plugged into input 4 of the mixer. If I hit the guitar, we can't hear it. In order to hear it, we need to turn this switch to line. Just play along with the recording, see how the levels are. Turn those other 2 signals down very slightly so I can hear the guitar better. It's probably good enough. Arm that track again, hit record and play, and go for a take. Okay, so we'll rewind that. Disarm track 4, set channel 4 to playback from tape. Let's hear what we've got. A little bit of warble in there, but that has basically worked. Rewind back, record some vocal improvisation onto track 2. The unit is now set up to record from input number 2. This cable just at the bottom of the screen is connected to a dynamic microphone. It's a cheap copy of an SM57. You can see that this mic line gain control is up about halfway for that microphone. The input switch is set to mic line. The fader is set at 7, so about unity gain. Because I'm in direct mode, I'm not concerned with the pan control. I'm actually going to pull down the low. This is because I'm going to be singing in falsetto and I'm going to be holding the microphone in my hand, so it just minimises this rumble. So if I turn that low end up, start rattling that, you can hear it, but if I do the same thing with it turned down, it's much less intrusive, and it doesn't really make too much difference to high sounds for a voice. Not really hear that much happening when I alter the low control when I'm singing that high. The other thing I'm going to do is actually turn up the reverb here. Because I'm in direct mode, the reverb isn't going to be recorded. It's just there as kind of a security blanket for me. I'm going to be doing some silly warbling and I'm going to feel less self-conscious and therefore make a better recording if I've got a bit of reverb on there. So turn up the auxiliary master send and receive to around unity gain, so about 7. That means that the reverb will be audible. Instead of just sounding like this, it's gonna sound like this. Yeah. There's a story which may be apocryphal that John Lennon, towards the end of his career, the reason he had so much slapback echo in his voice was because he had his own misgivings about the sound of his voice. But whether that's true or not, I, as somebody who ends up singing on recordings quite regularly, despite not really considering myself to be a singer, I can relate to that. Quite often I want to have a bit of decay or reverb while I'm singing to make me feel comfortable. And sure, I could commit it to tape at this point. I would have to use the other recording mode to do that. But I've got more options later if I just hear it in the room, but it's not on the tape. If I just hit pause and record. I'm mostly underneath 0. These two faders seem to have got turned down. I'm just going to turn them back up and see if I've got a decent blend to record with. So stop that, take it out of record mode. That's here. So I just pulled them down because I couldn't really hear my vocals enough, but I can now. So if we rewind, I'll go for a take and put that back into record mode first, of course. What a load of rubbish, but it was just for demo purposes, am I right? So if I rewind that back, if I turn down the auxiliary, put this into tape mode, we'll hear my dry vocals, and they're probably going to sound pretty bad. The point is, I could, at a later stage in mixing, add types of reverb or delay that may agree better with musical layers that haven't been overdubbed yet. Let's talk in a little bit more detail about some of the things I glossed over as I was making that very basic recording there. The first of them is to do with connections. The inputs along here are expecting 1/4 inch unbalanced jack sockets, so basically things that look like this, your standard kind of guitar cables. But when I was recording this drum machine, you can see that actually this is like a stereo 8-inch output, and then that's going to a couple of RCA plugs, and then there are these RCA to 1/4 inch adapters. Now, it's beyond the scope of this video to talk through every possible combination of adapter that's available in the market, but the thing is that A machine like this is going to handle the input from a lot of different devices pretty well. Like, no matter whether your synth or sound source, you know, your decks, your Chaos pad might have RC outs, your phone might have a little socket on it like that. It's expecting that kind of a plug. There's going to be cheap adapters on the market that you can get from like Amazon, eBay, supermarket or wherever. From the Porta Studio's point of view, all of these sorts of cables are sending roughly the same kind of signal, or at least a close enough a kind of a signal that this can handle it. And all you need to do is invest in a few pounds worth, a few dollars worth of little connector adapters like that, and you will be able to plug whatever into the front end of this, as long as it doesn't require balance cables or phantom power. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later in this video when I use condenser microphones on a drum kit. The other thing to discuss here as well is signal levels. Between the tape player and the inputs or outputs of this unit, mixer, the record amplifiers, playback amplifiers are representing compressions and rarefications in the air as alternating current signals. Those voltages are in a range that we would call line level, which is really a standardized volume of these voltages. And while some units, like the guitar pedals that I was just recording with, and some synthesizers are capable of spitting out a signal that is already at line level, there is a level of voltage below line level called instrument level, and then there's a level below that called mic level. So, likes of this microphone here, when I speak into it, there's a little diaphragm that gets moved back and forth. That moves a little electromagnet, and that creates a very tiny voltage. And that tiny voltage needs a lot of amplification before it's big enough so that this circuit can handle it. This little drum machine, we might say, is more at instrument level. It's not quite at line level yet, but it's definitely producing bigger voltages than this microphone does. So this explains why I was able to record the bass and the guitar to inputs 3 and 4, even though they don't have a little gain trim like this. Whereas the drum machine, at instrument level, I think it needed a little bit of boost, about a third of the way up. The microphone's even quieter, so it needed even more gain. I think I had the fader very slightly higher, but most of all I had this mic to line level trim here about halfway. If I tried to plug this little drum machine into inputs 3, 4, 5 or 6 without an external preamplifier, it would have been difficult to get it loud enough so that it was significantly above all the hissing noise that's generated by the tape. And it would have been pretty much impossible to try and get a good signal out of this microphone on one of these 4 inputs unless I had a really loud sound source that was driving the little electromagnet inside it really hard. So before you plug anything into it, have a rough idea of whether it's a mic level signal, usually a microphone, an instrument level signal, which will include some instruments, though some others and some pedals will be capable of producing a much louder signal than that, or whether it's at line level already. The other mode of recording that we have on the Yamaha MT2X is represented by the lower position on these switches. I'm going to refer to it as the bust mode. That's BUSSED. It's a bit more powerful and it's a bit more complicated, and I'm going to need to do several demonstrations to show you everything about how to use it. This bust mode allows us to do ping-pong recording. It allows us to make a stereo image out of many microphone signals. It allows us to combine many microphone signals into one mono tape track. And it allows us to use the microphone preamplifiers that are built into mixer channels 1 and 2 on signals that are destined for tracks 3 and 4. The limitation is that we should use the monitor bus in order to listen to our signal as we record, in order to keep what the tape receives and what we hear while we're performing separate, and that if we use effects while we're recording in this mode, they will be baked into the recording. You need to be very clear that although sometimes people, including me, will talk about channels and tracks like they're the same thing, they're actually pretty different. A channel is to do with a mixer, whereas a track is a physical location on a tape. In the direct mode, the relationship between the mixer channels and the tape tracks is fixed. Track 1 of the tape can only be accessed from input 1 of the mixer, track 2 of the tape can only be accessed from mixer input 2, tape track 3 is accessed through mixer input 3, and track 4 is accessed through mixer input 4. And that is because the signal is coming into the input, going through the fader and the EQ, but it's not reaching the pan. or the master control, you can imagine there's a location here above the pan control, and the signal's going zoop over to the tape just there. That means that when we're in the direct mode, we don't have to worry about the pan control. It means that what the tape hears is separate from the master control, and that means that we can listen on speakers, and there will be no danger of recording anything that's coming through the master fader onto the tape track. That allows us to do things like create a security blanket for ourselves by having effects audible in the auxiliary bus without them being committed to tape. In the bus mode though, we can send any of these 6 inputs to any of these 4 tape tracks, and we do that using the pan control. Tape track 1 can only accept its input from the left hand side of the master bus, and the same goes for tape track 3, but tape tracks 2 and 4 can only accept their input from the right hand side of the master bus. This means that if I were to arm all 4 of those tracks in that mode, tape tracks 1 and 3 would be receiving a duplicate of the same information, and tape tracks 2 and 4 would be receiving a duplicate of the same information. So that's kind of redundant. I can't really think of a situation where that would be useful. It's much more likely that we're either going to arm a pair like this. So if we're creating a stereo image, the left hand side of that image is getting stored on tape track 1, and the right hand side of that image is getting stored on tape track 2, or just arm one at a time. So let's say we wanted to record all 6 inputs of this mixer onto track 1. We could set that up, create a blend, and because they're all panned hard left, and tape track 1 is taking its input from the left hand side of this master fader, a mixture of input that's coming in and all 6 inputs of this mixer is going to end up on that tape track. If we had reverberation on the auxiliary bus and any of those tracks, that would be mixed in with the signal from the inputs at the master fader. And because the tape track is taking its information from the master fader, we would be printing the effect to tape under those circumstances. The other thing to be aware of is that if any of these mixer channels have tape as their input, then they're receiving information from these tracks, and the sound from tracks 1, 2 and 3 are going to be audible in the master fader. If we arm track 4 to take its input from the right bus, if we pan those 3 tracks 1, 2 and 3 to the right, then a mixture of what was on tracks 1, 2 and 3 is going to end up being copied to track 4. We would call that a bounce or ping-pong recording, and provided we were happy with the result, if we weren't, we could redo it, then we could record new material into tracks 1, 2 and 3, and that would give us 6 layers of sound, the blend of the 3 that's on track 4 and 3 new ones. Sometimes when we're using that mode, we don't actually want to do this ping-pong recording, so we don't want to send the signal from the tape through the main mixer when we're overdubbing in this mode. Instead, we want to use the monitor bus, but on this model, that's only audible through our headphones. So as I demonstrate this mode, I won't be monitoring through speakers unless I'm bouncing, that is ping-pong recording. Another reason that it's important to have this mode on this unit is that only 2 of our input channels have gain available where we can take a microphone level signal up to line level. So if I wanted to record information from a microphone onto all 4 tracks of the tape, but I don't possess an external preamplifier, then what I can do instead is use the pan control on input 1 or input 2 in combination with the bus mode to take the input of my microphone through this preamplifier and onto the 4 tracks of the tape one by one. So my first demonstration of recording in the bus mode will involve the use case that I just mentioned. I'm using one of the built-in preamplifiers to take the mic level signal up to line level and send it to all 4 of the tracks on the tape. I'm going to demonstrate that by recording a 4-part vocal harmony over a nonsense phrase. If you want to sing along, the lyrics are do be do be do be do be do 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 be do be do do. I'll sing that at the original pitch, about a third down, an octave up from the original pitch, and an octave down from the original pitch. I'm going to have effects in the auxiliary bus for all 4 of the tracks, and I'll change what the effect is every time I move to a new tape track, just to make it really clear that the contents of the auxiliary bus are being committed to tape when you're in this mode. So the first track will have reverb on the vocals, the second track will have delay in the vocals, the third track will have flanging on the vocals, and the last track will have a vibraphone tremolo effect on it. To avoid making a ping-pong recording of the pre-existing music onto the overdubbed tracks, I'm not going to be monitoring through the speakers. The only signal that you will hear through the speakers is the track that I'm currently recording, but I will be able to hear the pre-recorded tracks by turning up these monitor controls, and I'll be hearing them in my headphones, which are plugged in here. And then at the end, I'll put all 4 tracks into tape mode, set up a stereo image, and you'll hear all 4 of my vocals playing back together. Let's get started. First thing I will do is arm track 1 in the bus mode, which means it's going to be taking its input from the left hand side of the master fader. Because I'm plugged into mixer input channel number 1, I need to have that mixer channel panned hard left. The pan controls of the other 5 mixer inputs aren't going to matter. Turn up the fader so that it's about unity gain. I've already got this gain trimmer about halfway through, and actually you can hear the reverb coming through the speakers when I speak directly into the microphone. In order to monitor how hot that's going to tape, I'm going to pause the cassette player and then enter play and record mode. And now when I speak into the microphone, you can see the signal represented on the track 1 meter. And if I sing the phrase, dooby 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 doo doo, you can see it's going in a bit hot. It's going into the red, which would saturate, which I'm going to try and avoid because I've got DBX on. So I'll maybe turn down that gain a little bit. Now let's hear dooby 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 doo 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 dooby dooby doo doo. That seems a bit better. It's between -3 decibels and 0 decibels. So I can go for my first take. Setting my pitch so I know what to sing to. 1, 2, 3, 4. Dooby 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 doo doo, and dooby dooby doo doo. Stop. Rewind. Auto stop is on, so it will stop automatically. Now I will disarm track number 1, arm track number 2 in bus mode, and turn the pan control to the right so that the signal is being sent to the right hand side of the master fader, which is where tape track number 2 is going to accept its signal. I'm going to change the effect on the effect pedal so it's an analog delay. Delay. So you can hear the repeats now. If I pause and play and record, we should see that this meter representing what's incoming on track 2 is hitting about the same gain level. Dooby 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 doo doo. Which it is. So I'm going to turn up the monitor for track 1 so that I can hear it and my vocals in my headphones. Dooby 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 doo doo, dooby dooby doo doo. It's going to stop automatically because of 0 stop. Disarm this track, arm this track. Track 3 accepts its input from the left hand side of the master bus, so I must turn that pan control over to the left, change my effect again, and now it's a phasing effect. Hit pause, record play. Now you can see the input signal coming in on track 3. Dooby 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 doo doo. Seems like my vocals are slightly louder when I'm in falsetto like that, so I'll just pull back slightly from the microphone rather than adjusting these controls, which I could do. I'll turn up track 2 so I can hear it. I'll maybe have it slightly lower because it's the harmony part and I want to hear this track 1 louder since I'm trying to sing an octave up from that. Let's go for a take. Dooby 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 dooby. Stop. Rewind. Disarm that track. Arm track number 4. Track number 4 is accepting its signal from the right hand side of the master fader, so I must turn the pan control to the right. I'm going to change my effect again. This time it's a vibraphone, but it's sounding more like a tremolo. Hit pause and record play, and the input signal should appear on the 4th one of these meters. Dooby 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 doo doo, dooby dooby doo doo. Turn up the track that I just recorded in the monitor section so I can hear it in my headphones. Unpause and I'll be doing a take. Dooby 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 doo doo, dooby dooby doo doo. Something you may have noticed, and I didn't mention earlier, that the EQ for this mixer channel, I'm boosting the highs very slightly and I'm pulling down the lows significantly. The lows are going to cut out a lot of the rumble because I'm holding this cheap SM57 copy in my hand, so it'll reduce any handling noise without affecting the sound of my voice all that much. There's not that much information in my voice at the 100 Hz level. I've increased the treble because I just want to get a little bit more presence and clarity, because the dynamic microphone doesn't reproduce sibilance and so on perfectly, and also the tape medium cuts off a little bit of high end, so I find that tracking with a little bit of treble added, especially when I've got DBX on, which tends to mute the treble a little bit, is a little bit flattering. Anyway, that's all been done. I can rewind it. It's not going to sound amazing, but for demonstration purposes, it's probably going to be okay. So now if I set all 4 of these to tape mode, I'll set up a bit of a stereo balance. So the initial take I'll have in the centre, and I'll have quite high. The one that was a third down, I'll put off to, let's see, I'll send that almost hard left and have it a little bit lower. The one that's higher, I'll send almost hard right, the same level as the harmony, and then the lowest sound I'll probably have that lowest of all, and I'll put that maybe just right of centre. I'm going to set the auxiliary on all these channels flat so that we're only hearing the effects that are baked into the tape, and I'll also flatten out equalization. Okay, that should work. Here we go. Doobie 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 doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo, doobie 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 doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo. We can go back and monitor those individually just to show that the different effects have baked onto the tape. Here's track 1. 1, 2, 3, 4. Doobie 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 doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo. So that's the first track with the reverb on it. Here's the third down, approximately, with the analog delay on it. Doobie 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 doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo. Track 3, I'll centre these while I play them back actually. Doobie 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 doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo. So you can hear the flange on that, and then you'll hear this sort of tremolo effect on this low one. Doobie 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 doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo. Doobie 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 doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo. Doobie 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 doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo. And just to make it clear, I could easily have made a similar recording using input number 2, because it also has this extra gain available via this trimmer. And providing I had an external preamp that allowed me to get my signal up to line level, or I was just using a line level signal to begin with, I could equally have taken my inputs from any of these other input channels, 3, 4, 5, 6, and used the pan control in exactly the same way to route the signal to the tape tracks. In this next example, demonstrating the use of the bust mode, I'm going to be combining microphones into one mono track, and then I'm going to use bouncing to add an insert effect, and also use the tape as a kind of limiter by employing tape saturation deliberately. I'll talk you through the setup that I've got in my room. My drum kit's in the opposite corner of where I'm filming. I've got 2 inexpensive large diaphragm cardioid condenser microphones, and they're in what's sometimes called a recorder man setup. It's a variation of the Glyn Johns method, where you've still got one microphone pointed directly at the snare from an overhead position and one coming in from the floor tom, but in this case the floor tom side microphone is coming in over the drummer's shoulder from above, and the idea is that you can get away with a half decent picture of the drum kit and a half decent stereo image with only 2 microphones. However, in addition to that, I'm going to be miking up the kick drum from a couple of feet out using a large diaphragm dynamic mic, and I've got a dynamic mic pointed at the snare drum. And that's just to give me a little bit more detail and pick up the low end a bit better. To power the condenser microphones, which require phantom power and also require gain because they're going into mixer channels 3 and 4 on the Yamaha, which, as we've discussed, don't have any gain of their own. I'm using a Soundcraft notepad mixer. It's actually capable of providing phantom power to 4 microphones, but it's only got a left and right output. But since I'm only using 2 condenser microphones here, that's enough. The 2 dynamic mics are plugging directly into the Yamaha, and you can see that the gain is set pretty low. They're not needing a lot of gain because the source material is really loud, like I'm hitting a drum kit, and drum kits produce a lot of sound pressure. If I'm using 4 tracks, unless I'm using another 4-track machine to do what's called an external bounce or a reduction mix, then I tend to record drums in mono. So I'm blending all 4 of these microphones onto the left hand side of this master fader as I record. This is a destructive way of recording in the sense that I can't, after the fact, change the balance between the microphones. Like if I like a performance but I don't like the balance of the mics, then I've got a difficult choice of, do I try and get another take, or do I live with the imperfect mic balance and keep the good take? So this is a way of working that's probably more suitable if you're either recording a song for sketchbook purposes and you're not too bothered about the production, or you've done a certain amount of experimentation with how the microphones sound individually, how they sound in combination. Anyway, while I was making little test recordings, I've got a blend that seems to work okay. These 2 microphones here, those are the condensers, and these 2 are the dynamic mics. You'll also see that I'm attenuating, that is turning down the signal quite a bit, and that's because although if I were only going to record one of those signals individually, we would maybe see it coming up quite low on the meter, like maybe -10, -6 decibels. In combination, they're much louder. And so this balance of faders I found is giving me a signal that's just about peaking over 0. So it's not going to hit the tape that hard, and the initial recording I make won't incorporate any tape saturation. Once I've made the recording, I'll use a fake rack compression setting on this Zoom multi-stomp as an insert effect, as I just copy the track that's got all 4 of these microphones baked into it to an adjacent track. The way that this Zoom is set up, threshold's quite low, but the compression's quite low, so it's doing a gentle squashing to the whole signal, and then I'll make that signal hit the tape quite hard, and the tape should actually limit some of the peaks. And I'll be doing that just to illustrate that we can postpone some of the thinking about the mix and the production until after we've recorded. That could be useful, especially if you're someone like me, that you're a sort of a one-man band. You want to be able to think about your performance while you're performing and postpone some of the production details until you've got a take that you're happy with. Okay, I'm going to record a short section of drums now. You can see that track 1 is armed in the bust mode and all my inputs are panned hard left. Hit record and play. So what you heard there was just the camera microphone picking up the drums from the other side of the room. I will now put tape track 1 into tape mode and turn up that channel, put it in the centre, and can play back what we just recorded. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is make quite a hot copy of that to the track 2. So what I want to do is pan the signal left, turn the auxiliary up, turn the auxiliary send and return up to about unity gain for now. And then if I arm track number 2, then the auxiliary is only going to come in on the right hand side of the fader, and therefore we'll only be recording the 100% wet compressed signal to track 2. I'll play this to see what the levels are like first. What I want is to maybe see the loudest kicks and snares go up into the red on this meter. That would imply that those signals are going to be limited by the tape saturation in addition to the milder compression that we've got on the whole signal. So I was adjusting the auxiliary send just to get that effect with the meter. I'll rewind to the beginning and record that. The sound that you're hearing is the camera microphone picking up the cheapest near-field monitors that Mackie make. When you see this fader up, you'll hear a compressed signal, and when I have this fader up, it'll be uncompressed. Compressed. Uncompressed. You can do your own experimentation about what sounds good to you with your gear. I'm just trying to show you that bouncing isn't only for combining multiple tracks into a single track. It can be also used as a post-production tool to add effects. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you how you can use the bust mode to combine up to 6 inputs from this mixer into a stereo image which is stored on 2 tape tracks. For this section of the video I had planned to spotlight the drums, but it turns out that my collection of microphone stands doesn't really allow for that. So what I've actually got is 2 stereo pairs and 2 individual microphones that are quite close to the centre of the stereo image. Working from left to right, here we have a snare drum. This one is a copy of an SM57 made by Thomann. It's pointing at the centre of the snare drum and going into one half of a 2-channel analogue compressor made by Dromer that I just got for a bargain off eBay. The other half of that compressor is receiving its signal from a copy of a Shure D112 kick drum microphone that's just placed on top of a pillow inside the kick drum. I'm doing this partly to illustrate that you can record through insert effects. Just be aware that that's a destructive way of working in the sense that if you want to change the compression settings, you'll need to re-record the material. The output from the compressor is very hot, which is why gain sliders on these channels are pulled right down, and I'm further attenuating the signal by having these faders down about 2 or 3. In my stereo image, the kick drum is more or less dead centre and the snare drum is just off to the right. So you can see the snare signal is panned slightly right, the kick drum just a little bit to the left, really for a little bit of separation. The EQ on the kick drum mic is flat, but I'm attenuating the low end quite a bit on the snare just to minimise the bleed. Next we have the loudest stereo pair. This signal is going all the way to the left and this signal is going all the way to the right. So the one half of the stereo image is going to go straight to track 1 and the other half is going to go straight to track 2. These inputs are receiving a stereo blend from the same Soundcraft mixer that I showed in an earlier segment. What I'm doing here is providing phantom power and gain to a pair of large diaphragm condenser mics, which are maybe 2 feet out from the drum kit at 45 degrees from the centre of what I consider to be the centre of the stereo image, which is pretty much the kick drum, or the space between the kick drum and the snare. And those signals are being combined with a ribbon microphone. The ribbon microphone is a figure of 8 pattern, so I've got the dead node pointed directly at the centre of the image. It's at kick drum level, so we're getting a lot of the ambience from the kick drum, which should blend nicely with the close kick drum signal that I've got from that D112 copy inside the kick drum. And the signal from that microphone is panned in the middle of this stereo pair that's coming from the notepad mixer. You'll see in the EQ that I'm exaggerating the low end from those microphones very slightly, but I'm attenuating the high end a little bit. I'm getting the high end from a pair of condenser mics that are situated immediately above the cymbals. They're small diaphragm microphones, so they should be slightly less sensitive to the low end anyway. And then if we follow the leads from those microphones, we can see that I'm actually providing them with phantom power using my Tascam 488 Mark II. So I'm not adding any EQ, I'm not using the tape section of that machine, I'm just using as a phantom power and preamp going into channels 5 and 6, since they don't have any preamplification of their own. Again, this is a stereo image, so those signals are panned left and right. So I'll go away and make a recording, and when we come back we'll monitor the recording that I made. So to play back the recording, if I want to retain the stereo image that I've created, I must have the pan controls for the tape tracks containing the stereo information panned hard left and right. When I say panned hard left and right, what we can do is something like this, and what we're doing is making the stereo image a bit narrower. So for instance, at the moment the 2 tones of crashes are very much left and right. If I thought that was too distracting as I was listening back to it on headphones, what I could opt to do is make that image a little bit narrower, so I could achieve that like that. But if you do this, then you'll lose your stereo information when you play back. Anyway, I'm going to pan them hard left and right to begin with, and you can see that I've turned up the high EQ a little bit on playback. That's just to compensate for the way that the tape attenuates treble and the way that DBX attenuates treble. So that you hear the stereo information properly, I'm actually recording this using my Zoom H6 handy recorder, so you're hearing a proper digital capture from these outputs rather than just my camera audio in the room. Let's hear what I've got. Here what I'll do is I'll just narrow. So for the rest of this, the distinction about where the left and right crashes are should be less obvious. I had mentioned earlier an external bounce. This is where you take all 4 tracks mixed in stereo from one tape recorder and place it onto another tape recorder on 2 tracks. Fill up those 2 tracks, so that means you've got 6 layers, and then you dump that back on the original tape player, and then you're left with 2 tracks open again. 2 of the main problems with working in that way are, 1, you need to have 2 tape machines, which I do, but I realise that a lot of people don't. And secondly, any wow or flutter is cumulative. Like if you bounce within this machine, any irregularities in the cassette speed due to either the motor's a little bit unhealthy or the rubber's not great, they will actually cancel each other out. Whereas if I record the output of this to my MT2X, all the inconsistencies of this cassette player will be baked into the recording of the MT2X. The MT2X is a bit more stable, but it'll add a little bit of its own wow and flutter when I record back to here, and then a 3rd layer of wow and flutter from this unit will be added when the stereo information comes back from the MT2X. So I'm going to demonstrate that just so that you know how to do it, show you those disadvantages of an external bounce or reduction mix, as I've sometimes heard it called. And we can use the song that I create with all its imperfections to demonstrate a last few things about capturing the output of one of these machines, either as a stereo pair or as 4 individual mono files that we might want to process further in the digital domain. We'll look at adding different amounts of the same effect to different signals. I guess I'm breaking the 4th wall of green screening here by showing you the setup, but I think this is the easiest way to explain what's happening. I have gone away and using exactly the same microphone setup as you heard for that drum demo, I've recorded the drums for Blood of My Enemies by Manowar, and then I've used my pedals to overdub a guitar part and a bass part. In the spirit of treating music as a poultice for the soul rather than something you're trying to show to someone else to prove how perfect you are, I really kept the first complete take where it wasn't catastrophic. I've got a balance and a stereo image set up on this mixer. I've also got a spring reverb in the auxiliary send, and I'm sending varying amounts of that to the different instruments. So if I play and stop, you'll hear the reverb cut out. Whereas if I pull the auxiliary out, it just stops abruptly when I stop the tape. The stereo output from the MT2X is going into mic line inputs 1 and 2 on the MT2X, which are being routed to tape tracks 1 and 2 on a 2nd tape. I've got the EQ set flat, and I've got it pretty much unity gain, so if I press play again, it's going to be upside down, but you're going to see these armed tracks on the meter on this unit flashing in this corner here. And then we're monitoring the sound via the speakers in the room from the stereo output of the MT2X. So all I'm doing is taking the 4 tracks that are on the MT2X, creating a stereo image of them with effects and putting them onto tracks 1 and 2 of a 2nd cassette. I can take that 2nd cassette out of this machine once I've done that and put it in here, and then I will have tracks 3 and 4 open where I can lay my vocals on top of them. So I'll just rewind this back to the beginning of the song. The MT2X is already in pause record mode. It is now recording. You can probably see that counter ascending so far. I'm now making a reduction mix or external bounce to a 2nd machine. Since that last clip, the recording that I made on the MT2X has been recorded from the MT2X back onto 2 tracks with a 3rd tape. Why a 3rd tape? You might think, oh, just take the tape out of the MT2X and put it in here. And sometimes you'll get lucky and that will work well, but even though I've calibrated both the MT2X and this, there's something off with the DBX settings, which are settings I tend to leave alone. And so there are level discrepancies, and I actually find that even though that it does bake in a bit more of the high cut that you get from the cassette medium and the warble that's coming from the irregularities of the motors in these things, I was getting better results by recording back onto a 3rd tape. Then on tracks 3 and 4, we've got vocals, backing vocals, there's a guitar solo, there's a guitar overdub. As I record this out of the stereo out into a recorder that's just off screen, you're going to see me doing a couple of mixer moves around the vocals. What happened was I did do the vocals in pretty much one take, but then when I was overdubbing the guitar parts a couple of times, although I stopped the recording in time, I then hit record without rewinding back, and so I kind of destroyed part of my original vocal recording. So there's a little bit of fiddling about I need to do to get some redos of the vocals in. When you mix the output of a tape to a stereo master, whether you're recording to another cassette player, some people record these things on VHS or reel-to-reel to keep it in the analog domain, or you're going to some sort of digital situation, which is what I'm doing today. What you're going to find is there's going to be a sort of performance that you have to kind of practice of moving all the faders and controls in the right place. But anyway, I'll go for a take now.
Of light, mighty messengers, healing rage are coming, gods of the dead. I ride through the air and laugh as I die. With powers of evil, dark knowledge is mine. Ride on the way.
As you can see there were quite a few fiddly little moves with the EQ and the faders and the pan controls and everything. I also don't have any mid controls on this deck. What if I wanted to apply some parametric mids on this baked in band recording on tracks 1 and 2? Maybe I want to make the snare a little bit louder, make some of the sort of sibilant sounds on the guitar a little bit quieter. One of the things I could do, instead of trying to do this mix on the board into stereo output, is I could just capture what's on the tape from the 4 tape outputs. In my case, I'd be using a Zoom H6 handy recorder. It's got 4 inputs, and then I can take the WAV files off of the SD card and put them onto my computer. If you have a computer with an audio interface with 4 line level inputs, you could use that. I could then set up the balance of the different levels, automate any changes of level, set up the pans, automate those, apply EQ, apply compression, yada yada yada. That's why it's good to have 4 tape outs on something like this. You get a bit more control over the mix and mastering in the digital domain, having done most of the process here in the analog domain. I will say that I'm not really an analog purist. It has a characteristic sound which I like, but largely I use this sort of technology because of the limitations that it imposes on me. It stops me from going down a rabbit hole of second guessing every decision or going through a million presets every time I try and record a song. Digital solutions will give you a more accurate recording, but I personally find that the sort of shortcomings that a recording made on a device like this has, if not charming, then certainly livable with. Ultimately for me, music's a hobby. It's something that I do because in my soul and my mental health I feel better when I do it, and I find this a more pleasing way to work than doing a lot of stuff in the DAW. I tend to only really use the DAW for nip and tuck nowadays. Anyway, I think we've come to the conclusion of this video. Thanks for sticking around to the end. I hope you learned something, or at least infotained you in some way. Please consider liking the video, leaving a comment if you've got a question, subscribing if you haven't already. Briefly mention I've got a Patreon. There is exclusive videos up there. It's quite cheap to join, and it's also possible for you to make a PayPal donation via my blog, where you can download free service manuals among other things. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you again soon.